Tonight we're bringing you the old homes of Dighton by our town historian, Elaine Varley.
The oldest map we have to work by is 1850, so sometimes it's difficult to pinpoint these houses. This house is almost across from the town office. It was built by James Briggs, and his son, Stout George Briggs, built the walls. This house was built in 1775. Stout George was born, I believe, 1776. He was one of the world's strongmen. Said that he lifted a cannon when he was in London without any strapping. It took him 10 years to build this wall with the auction and his wife's help. His daughter Amelia's shoe is at the Dighton Historical Society. It is a high shoe, size 13. These are the stone walls that he built. Some of the capstones are 4 feet. This is the old town hall, a Dighton Rock Grange. This was built about 1869, an article on March 17th in the town meeting records of 1869. They voted to buy land and put up a building, and they voted $3,000. This building was nearer the street, and in 1935, when the high school was to be built, it was moved back to make room for the parking lot, and the town sold it to the Grange for $1. Just recently, the Grange turned it back to the town, and now it's used for the Intertribal Council for Indians and for Boy Scouts and so forth. This house is at the corner of Center and Route 138. It's the second house on the site. The first house was called the Mansion House, and right across the street from the old Woodard farm there was a bowling alley and ice house. This is Captain Crane's house on Center Street. He was master of the sloop Sally. In 1795 it was built in Berkeley. The story is that when they were in Valparaiso, Stout George Briggs was a member of his crew, and in the War of 1812 the British were pressing American soldiers and sailors into service, and they had quite a fight, and Stout George Briggs is said to have killed 5 or 6 men. The cudgel, or stick that he used, is in the Dighton Library. This is the David Standish house. It's the home of the director of the Bristol County Agricultural School. It was around 1800. The Standishes built ships north of the Dighton-Berkeley Bridge in what they call Pine Hill, which is now part of the Bristol County Agricultural School. This is Captain Abram Briggs' house. It's a late 18th century. He did trade in the West Indies. Later on, Thaxter, a man by the name of Thaxter, collector of taxes for Fall River, lived there. Other families have lived there. The former selectman Clayton Atwood lived there. The present owner is now Bruce Atwood, and it's being restored. They're working on it right now. The Dighton Historical Society has a tip-top table that belonged to Captain Briggs. This is very difficult to see. I've got to take a better slide. This is an older slide. This is further down the street before you get to Elm Street. This is on the west side of the street. It may be the second house on the site. Helen Lane thought it might be. But this was Thomas Church. He was Lieutenant Governor of Massachusetts, and he lived here. The legend is that Lafayette stopped here, and that Thomas Church had a store on Rocky Nook, which is across the street and across the railroad tracks down to the river, and there is a wharf there, and that is the area known as Rocky Nook. Side view of the church house. This house is at the corner of Brook and Elm, the Richmond House, about 1754, Thomas Richmond. Later on, a Mr. Chase lived there. He was father of Senator Chase, and he was one of the first ones to start growing strawberries in Dighton to be shipped to Boston. Senator Chase was a state senator from 1910 to 1911 and a selectman in Dighton for 34 years. He had a lot to do with the water in Dighton and the Somerset's rights to the Sagregansett River. We had some fairly new members, the Historical Society, that got his picture out, which we had behind the door, and wanted to hang it. But we told them, turn it to the wall. That's the way we felt, because the water was supposed to have been supplied to the rest of Elm Street, down Main Street, down Pleasant, up to Hart, and then up to the standpipe or tank on Richmond Hill. Instead, the water went down Chase Avenue, down County, and up the hill and crossed through the farms. Didn't even go as far south as Hart Street. So a lot of people felt that Senator Chase sold us down the river. This is the Gushy House. Reverend Smith owned it at first, and in 1800 he sold it to Reverend Gushy. And it was a school for boys. The house is about a 1740. And Mr. Gushy was preacher at the community church for 57 years. Reverend Smith moved to Canandaigua, New York, and was one of the first preachers there to preach to the Indians. This house is Grant Simmons' house, built around 1900, because it's not on the 1895 map. Before he built this house, he purchased the farm of Baylies, which is on the east side of the street. This house is on the west side of the street. And in 1900, he built this house. This is the Bayliss Estate house, pre-revolutionary. Hodijah Bayliss lived here, and he was aide-de-camp to General Washington. It may have been a tavern at one time. Mr. Bayliss was first custom inspector of Dighton. He was manager of the iron works in Westville, where the anchor to Old Ironsides, the U.S. Constitution, was forged. The anchor was taken by ox cart down to Dighton and then shipped to the Constitution that was being built. This is the Whitmarsh Tavern at the corner of Elm Lane and Elm Street. William Ellery and Ezra Stiles fled Newport, Rhode Island, when the British came. William Ellery was a representative from Rhode Island to the Continental Congress and rode his horse back and forth from Dighton to Philadelphia. I'm sure he didn't do it every day. Ezra Stiles preached at the community church and read the Declaration of Independence from the pulpit. In later life, he became president of Yale. This is the Dean Tavern, present owner William Mendoza. Dr. Wood's home. This is in early 18th century. In 1824, Dr. Wood became a collector of customs, and then in 1829 to 1833. His son, Alfred Wood, started the Dighton Nursery off of Elm Street. Later it was run by Josiah Place and his sons, and then I believe it was from them that the Christensens bought it, and Rudy Christensen carried on the business. growing flowers there. This is a community church. Pre-Revolutionary War. Was used as a sheep's pen and soldiers' barracks during the war, and was finished after the war. Now, this is a cemetery stone fairly close to the church, as you can see, and this story was told to Helen Lane, former town historian, and myself by Norman Boyd, Mrs. Cobb's father. The acorns on the, he had 2 wives, and the acorns on the tree, on the stone, tell the story. The empty acorns were children that died, and the full acorns stand for those that live. This is the council oak we've seen a lot of lately. King Philip and his braves held council here. This is off Elm Street, but it's easier to get there from off Milk Street through the gravel bank. It is thought that the south purchase of Dighton was signed over from the Indians to the town of Taunton and then Dighton under this tree. This is the Brown Tavern. It was a pre-Revolutionary War house. It was a stage stop on the way to Bristol, Rhode Island. Captain Dr. Charles Talbot lived there in later years. Before that, Mr. John Hathaway ran a post office and store there, as well as a store on Zebulon Landing, which is the end of Main Street. The L is now gone, was a dance hall. This is at the corner of Elm and Main Street. This is Allen Pitts. Notice the gamble roof. Pre-Revolutionary War. Allen Pitts was on a committee to regulate prices of mechanics and labor at that time. And guns purchased by the town were stored here to be used later in the Revolutionary War. The Baptist Church. This is believed to be the second church, as the first Baptist church was on School Lane in a very small building, almost like a small schoolhouse. This house was is now the Bouffard's house, and it was a Captain William Richmond that did a lot of shipping. This house was built around 1794. Later was owned by Luther Talbot, and he drove a baggage wagon from Boston to Bristol, Rhode Island. There's another view. A man by the name of Mr. Ingalls lived here, and he was a blacksmith. He ran a store on the opposite corner, and the blacksmith shop was moved at the time that the library was built. It is the top half of the house across the street from this, on the north side of the street, where Bill's Sore Thumb workshop is. Dighton Methodist Church is built 1893. I always remember that date. It was the year my father was born. It's built on the site of the Dighton Academy, and the Dighton Academy was moved across the street and the top put on, and it was raised to be the Universalist Church, but now is it a residential home. It's a house just east of the library. The Methodist Church is owned and lived in by the Sylvia family today. This is a house up on Hart Street. I believe it's made of stone. We do not have too much information on this, except that it's on the 1850 map. This house was just renovated, and now will not go into Boston because it's called non-contributing to the historical district. They gutted the whole insides of it, so that the only thing that really is old is the outside of it. It was a Pierce house, about 1850. This may have been a corn crib, but it's an old shed anyway, so we just took the picture. This was a farmhouse of Howell Carr. It was an Anthony Pierce in 1850. In 1800s, a John Pierce, and in 1811, a G. Pierce lived there. This was a Joseph Talbot House in the 1700s. Hathaway lived there in 1858. Before that, John Simmons lived there. We do not have too much information on this house. It was a tourist house in recent years. We do have just the picture. We have to do more research on that one. These are the flowers that round what was Annie Carr's house, which was a John Simmons house coming up. He was a selectman in 1776. He was a selectman in 1776. This is Lewis Carr's barn. The barn is old, but the house isn't, because in the 1909 or 1910, Louis and Howell and Hanford somehow managed to burn the house down, the original one. This house in recent years was a Joy house. I believe that one of the Carr girls is living there now. It was built before 1744, and it was a John Simmons, then an Oliver Simmons, who was selectman in 1859 and 1860. He was a stonemason by trade. This is a historical society, the Winslow Davis house, taken quite a few years ago, as that's Helen Lane's car, and we were in much more need of paint than we are at the present time. It was built by Jobs Winslow. He was a colonel in the Bristol County Militia, and he sold it about 1793 to Samuel Davis, who was a farmer, and he was a selectman from 1836 to 1854 in Dighton. Winslow was a surveyor of roads. That's the sign that goes with it. It's made at the vocational department of the DR. This was a Talbot Horton house, and it was a Reed house in 1845. I don't know who the present owner is, because the family I did know that they moved. We do not have too much information on this house. I just have the slide. But during World War II, the airplane tower for spotting was behind this house, and many people in Dighton, I know my mother and father, the Hawkses, spent time there spotting planes day and night, and it was a very cold place. They just had a little tiny heater, and I remember that no one seemed to want to do the 2 o'clock in the morning to 6 or midnight to 6, and my father would do it and then get up to work in Mount Hope. This is Elder Goff's meeting house in West Dighton Church, about 1796. When this was a Baptist church originally. When they first formed, they met in a carriage shed at the house that is across the street where Ernest Horton now lives. And then when it began to get colder weather, they knew they had to get inside, so they held meetings inside of the house, with part of which was a store. And then they got money enough to build the church. This is the parsonage of the church. It's just north of the church. It was John Westgate lived there, and he's in 1850. He served the town collecting taxes for 8 pence on the pound. Then Miss Paul lived there in 1858. This isn't too good a picture, but the reason I took this is because it has fish scale shingles. The top half of this house, one down on Pleasant Street. I don't know, but there's one other in town, but that's about it. Very unusual. I think the Hendricks house on Pleasant Street is the one that has the fish scale shingles. L. Goff lived here in 1858. This is the mantle inside of Ernest Horton's house, which is diagonally across from the church. It was an old Brad Goff home. And what is now their living room was the store. And on Saturday nights, they used to have dances in there because my grandmother told me so. She used to dance there. This is Peter Pitt's house. Peter Pitts I died in 1775. Peter Pitts II was a captain and served and went to Boston and served under General Washington. He was a Minuteman. After the war, the family moved to New York State and settled Pittstown. I believe the Lombardis own this house. Different people have done restoration in it. This house is at the corner of Oak Street. And an 1850 map says it's the estate of E.H. Witherell, and we have nothing further on that house at present. This house is at the corner of Oak Street. We do not have much on that one either. This house is on Tremont Street. In 1858, it was owned by G.Reed and Gay. It's where the kennels are now. This house on the 1850s is not on the 1850 map, it's on the 1895, and it is a Mrs. Smith, not the Eleanor that we knew, but Eleanor Smith later lived in it. It has a mansard roof, and Arthur Hathaway lived there from 1855 to 1880. This house is a duplex, now owned by the Kings. It was an Eddy house, and I don't know exactly when it was built, but it had to be built before 1893, because I have a picture of this house with my grandmother and my aunt and my uncle in the picture, but my mother was not in the picture, so she hadn't been born, and she was born in 1893, so the picture had to be taken before then. Erudite Dam. This is Rahleigh's house, and Charles Gilbert, before he died, went around with me and gave me a lot of information on these houses. The bay window was used as a bakery in 1900. Before that, in 1850, a Mrs. Davis lived there, and in 1858, a W.B. Smith. This was a Rasmussen house a few years back. And about before 1900, a William Shaw owned it, and the pasture land in back of it. He gave land in 1900 for the school on School Street. This was a Talbot House in the 1900s. It was a Reed house before that. It's about 1850. And this house is on Pearl Street. It's where Harry Baxter Green lived. It was a Charles Jones. In 1895, Nat Lincoln from the paper mill lived there, and he was an executive in the North Dighton Cooperative Bank. Harry Baxter Green was presented the post cane here by the Historical Commission a few years back. This is Stoddard Avenue. I believe it's owned by Mrs. Vargas. Charles Gilbert told me that this house was made from a shed at the Dighton Manufacturing Company. Now, the Dighton Manufacturing Company was just east of where the hospital was somewhere about in the driveway to the present bank. And later on, they held their business in the lower part of the hospital because my mother and father worked there, and that's where they met each other. The Dighton Manufacturing was a subsidiary, I guess, of Mount Hope. And this is not too good a photo, but Ed Almy lived here. I believe this is Josephine Conti's house. He ran a store on Lincoln Avenue. This is Spring Street. Now we're on Summer Street. I believe this was a Waldron house. No, a Chadwick, sorry, 1871 map. This is the Waldron spool factory. Evidently they made spools there, according to Charlie Gilbert. I can't tell you much more about it than that. And this is Pete Cummins' house, and this was a Waldron's house, but they were carpenters, not the bakers that lived on School Street. I don't have the house, but this is the barn or shed that belongs now to the Catons. James Luther was a farmer. He was a Medal of Honor winner in the Civil War, and about 5 years ago, he with another Taunton person were honored with ceremonies. He was buried at the Westville Cemetery. Dighton Historical Societies has pictures of the event. He also was a constable, according to Charles Gilbert. He remembered him being a constable. And this is the O'Connell house on Andrew Street. It was built by Lyman Briggs. This is the Mount Hope Street. This is the Wald House that was moved from in front of the mill to make the park about 1921. This is Hattie Martin's family house, was another one moved to make the park. Known by older people and workers at Mount Hope as Bonus Park. They were supposed to have got a bonus or a raise, and they didn't get it. It didn't come, so people started calling the park Bonus Park. The present owner of this house is our selectman, is Belichick. This house was a part of the Walker farm on School Street. Date about 1858. Hattie Walker lived there, and his son Roy Walker, who was on the school committee many years along with my father. This is at the Fork. This is on Summer Street at the fork of Forest and Summer Street. In 1871, a White lived there, and the present owner is Ann Ekman and her husband, but I believe the house is older than 1871. Now this is the Chadwick House on Summer Street. This house was moved, I believe, when the calendar room, the mill, was built out to where it is now. Houses along Summer Street had to be moved, and some of them were moved up onto Spring Street. And I believe, I don't know, this is another one that was moved from the corner of Summer. This one, I believe, was John Stanley's house. And this was moved to Spring Street when the calendar room was expanded. But also some people say that was the third house in Bonus Park. There were 3 houses that were moved. I'm not sure because I wasn't around at the time to do much about it. There's another one that was moved. It's on Spring Street. This is on Forest Street. This is a very old house. You see how it sags in the middle? This is a John Silver and John Rose house. I believe Mello named the family that lives there now. And according to Charles Gilbert, this house and the next house here were the last of the mill houses that were moved from what they call Mount Hope Lane or Mount Hope Alley, now Mount Hope Street. And these are on Winter Street, and they, of course, added the dormers to them. And this is Charles Gilbert's house. It was built by Darius White about 1830 or so. He was a captain, sea captain. And then the next house, Edith, oh, this is still Charles. This one was owned by Edith and Henry Burt. Present owner is Tita. Captain Lewis White was the builder, and he was captain of the light militia in Wellington Infantry Company. His wife, Agnes Tyrrell, was related to the Hershey chocolate people, according to Charles Gilbert. Henry Burt was the chief fire warden of Bristol County, lived here. This is Laundries on School Street. All I know is that it was part of the Glynn farm. A lot of the area there were farms. This is the Soares house, and this was part of the Lord farm. This is John Bentoncote's house. We do not have any further research done on that one. This is Dot O'Connor's. 1900, a Mansfield a family by the name of Mansfield lived there. It was built about 1850. And then it was part of the Walker farms. Now, according to Harry Willis, he said this house was made out of a barn. So, and they thought it might have been made for the hired help that the Walker farm had. I believe this house on Old Somerset Avenue is gone now. Was it when I took the picture? This was a Joseph Warner house, 1871. It's on the west side of the street, right across from Charles Harris's house. When I was a little girl, a woman by the name of Viola Marsden lived there, and we called her the Candy Lady. She used to go up and down the street, going into everybody's house and selling bars of candy. I imagine she bought them wholesale, and that's how she made a little bit of money. This house is the Rawls Silver House. It's on the north side of Tremont Street. It was a Gooding farm, and it goes back into the 1700s. This is Almy's store on Lincoln Avenue. It was just south of where the Johnny's Market is at present. My mother used to talk about going to Almy's store at night for ice cream. She lived on South Street. This is the present post office being moved, but I don't know where it was moved from. It looks very much like it might have been a duplex mill house that were on Spring Street. Lincoln Paper Mill on Lincoln Avenue looking north. This, I'm not sure whether it belongs to the paper mill, but my father thought it was in front of Dighton Furnace. Now, Dighton Furnace was where the present warehouse or the former bowling alleys of Mount Hope. And it burnt when my mother said she was about 12 or 13. There's Lincoln Paper Mill after it burnt. But then it was rebuilt because the paper mill was there, taken down in the 30s. I remember that. Second one. This was another picture, I believe, of the Dighton Furnace. Now we're back where we started.
Well, thank you, Elaine. We really enjoyed it.